Thank you so much, Michael. The admiration is mutual. You all do such great work. And I've already had such a wonderful day seeing old friends and brand new grad students full of ideas. So it's really a pleasure to be here. My talk today is called Should You Believe Wikipedia? An Introduction to Social and Virtue Epistemology with Questions about the Utility of Philosophy for HCI. As I was getting ready to preparing my talk earlier this week, I'm a pack rat. I have a digital pack rat, not a physical pack rat. I have a lot of old emails that I never deleted, and I actually was able to find an email from me to Terry Winograd with the abstract of my talk from December 1997. I'll let you guys read that while I talk. I think it's fascinating to me that I am still addressing these questions. What benefit do online communities bring to their members? How are they designed? I tweeted this, and James asked, so the grocery store clerk, how is he doing? Well, it turns out he's my college roommate's ex-husband. He's a real dude. And it was a great excuse to reach out to him. And he was completely flattered that I had talked about him in a talk in 1997. And he was happy to be back for the talk in 2021. So, hey, y'all, Chuck says hi. He ran a comics mailing list. When his full-time job was as a grocery store stock clerk for a decade. My college roommate came from an economically less advantaged background, got her Ivy League degree and moved back to where she came from as if the whole college thing had never happened, and married her high school sweetheart. And that's the grocery store stock clerk. And Chuck said that he actually made enough money off of his comics list that he had to file taxes with it. And he now works as an insurance analyst. So it's a happy story with a happy ending. James, I found out for you. And it was really fun to have an excuse to reconnect. But these questions, I'm still thinking about them, even if the 1997 phrasing is a little cringy. So let's move on to my talk for today. Is human activity changing the climate? How do you know? I walked around TSRB back when people actually worked together in the same building and asked people that question. And here are the answers I got. Someone said, I've read abstracts of a few scientific studies and heard reports on the science on news sources I trust. Someone else said, I read one study all the way through and beyond that, heard about it on the news. I've never actually read any climate science, but I've heard news reports. How do you know that human activity is changing the climate? Isn't it interesting to think about, wait, I'm absolutely certain about this, but how did I form that certainty? Where did it come from? One person I spoke with had empirical evidence. She said, I took a trip to Alaska recently. We had to walk 2 hours to get to the glacier. They told me that just a few years ago, the glacier was right there. You didn't have to walk to get to it at all. Everyone here is relying on sources they trust to form opinions. So this raises the question, wait, what is knowledge anyway? So I'm going to review some philosophy today and try and apply it to the internet, and then problematize the question of how useful this is and what we as HCI researchers can do to make philosophy useful to us in our practice. So the formal definition of knowledge is justified true belief, which just leads us to more questions. What does it mean for a belief to be justified? And what does it mean for something to be true? And I'm going to talk about them in that order, even though that feels a little backwards, but I think it's easier to explain that way. So when you learn something, when are you justified in believing it? How do you make a decision? This thing that I was just told, how do I decide whether to believe it or not? If you're on a game show and I say, the contestant on the game show says, I just know the car is behind door number 3. Even if the car is really behind door number 3, that is not knowledge. That was luck. It might have been there because you didn't have a reason to believe the car was behind door number 3. Unless, of course, the stagehand whispered in your ear, hey, pick door number 3. That one has the car. So you have to have a reason for believing something. Now, there are 2 approaches to justification. There are a lot of approaches, but 2 central ones. One of them is evidentialism. Evidentialism says beliefs must be supported by evidence, and beliefs can be derived from basic beliefs. Basic beliefs are things you learn through your senses, and spontaneously formed beliefs can be basic if they are a proper response to experience. Non-basic beliefs are derived from basic ones. So for everything you believe, you have to have evidence all the way down the chain for why you believe that, and then why you believe that, and then why you believe that, and all the way down to some bedrock of basic belief. So there's a question of to what extent this is useful in practice, because it's almost impossible for every little thing we want to know about to research it all the way down to the bedrock of basic belief. And I think this problem that, no, you can't research everything down to the base expresses one of the core problems of the internet today. This just isn't practical. So a second approach to justification is reliabilism. Reliabilism says a belief is reliable if it's the result of a reliable cognitive process. And I love this example from Richard Feldman. Compare a novice bird watcher and an expert bird watcher together in the woods, seeking out the rare pink-spotted flycatcher. A bird flies by, and each person spontaneously forms the belief that there is a pink-spotted flycatcher there. The expert knows this to be true, but the novice is jumping to conclusion out of excitement. The expert has a well-founded belief, but the novice does not. So in this view of justification, you judge the reliability of the process that generated the idea. And this is a little more practical to use in practice. So within this framework, one might say the New York Times is generally a reliable source. Now, modulo some epic failures they've made in the past, we'll maybe excuse those, maybe not. In general, if you believe the New York Times, you're making a reasonable decision. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, it's fair to say the New York Times is a reliable cognitive process. Okay, so something, in order for something to be knowledge, you have to be justified in believing it, and it has to be true. But what does it mean to be true anyway? So we see the world through our senses. All our representations of the world are approximations. I was a physics major undergrad, and as a freshman physics major, I thought that we were learning the approximate solutions to solve problems because we were just little physicists. And when we were big grown-up physicists, we would learn the real solutions. Of course, I quickly learned that that was silly. Everything is always an approximation. Whether we're thinking about mental representations or external physical representations, like things we write down or record in some, make recordings in some fashion, they're all always approximations. There's a great story by Borges expressing the fact that the only perfect map of the territory is the territory itself, and everything else is approximate. There is one perfect representation. The universe is a representation of itself, a perfect one. But everything else, you're making approximations, and you make those approximations through what you perceive with your senses. So is that a chair? If I said use the raise hand feature, if you think that's a chair, I think most of you, I hope, would raise your hands that that's a chair. How do we know that that's a chair? The objective view of, thank you for all the raised hands. Yes, you see it, yeah, it's a chair. The objective view of reality says the chair exists and is knowable. The subjective view of reality says we're trapped within our subjective perceptions, and I can't really be sure the chair is there. I love this compromise by Hilary Putnam of internal realism. Internal realism says, okay, smarty pants. Yes, all our perceptions are subjective, but we all agree there's a chair there. If it's totally subjective, why do all 135 people on this seminar all agree that there's a chair? And the answer is the chair exists. I can't prove to you that the chair exists, but I'm going to explain the shocking total correlation in our purely subjective perceptions by saying that our subjective senses are perceiving something which is actually there. The world exists. So the world exists, but is understandable through subjective senses. Subjective and fallible senses. So, okay, the world exists, but is only knowable through fallible senses. How do we agree on what's true? Latour and Woolgar argue that the process of something becoming true is social. Let's talk about the process of something becoming a scientific fact. The example is the unit I'm using here is the unitary charge on the electron. When they first wrote their paper in 1909, you could say that Millikan and Fletcher claimed that the charge on the electron is unitary. As it became more accepted, you might change that to, since the charge on the electron is unitary, citation, Millikan and Fletcher. And then finally, in the third stage, you don't even need to mention Millikan and Fletcher, E, yeah, I know. The charge on the electron is unitary. What just happened? Going from someone claims X to X is true, here's a ref, to no, just X is true, I don't even need a ref, is a process of social acceptance of the idea. The more people believe something, the more it is true. Now, socially constructed knowledge is sometimes wrong. We make mistakes all the time, but what we all agree is true is the best version of what is true that we have at any given moment. So far we know the world exists, we perceive it through subjective senses, and we decide what's true through social agreement, through the social construction of knowledge. So the next question we have to ask is, what are good practices for achieving that agreement? I love this theory of virtue epistemology. It's my new favorite thing. It's a synthesis of virtue ethics and epistemology. And it argues that dealing with knowledge appropriately is a lifelong journey. And to do so, we strive to embody epistemic virtues, good habits and ways of dealing with knowledge. So I need to take a quick detour here to explain virtue ethics. I have been teaching basic ethical theory to our undergrads for 15 or so years. And more, I think if you made me teach only one theory, it would absolutely be virtue ethics. And, Kantianism is nice, utilitarianism is nice. Virtue ethics is by far, to me, the most profound. So virtue ethics has its roots in Aristotle and asks the question, what kind of a person do you want to be? Embodying the virtues that you choose is the best way to achieve eudaimonia, which translates roughly as the kind of happiness that is worth having. So say that you choose honesty as a virtue that you wish to embody. learning to be honest is a lifelong journey. I love in the literature on virtue ethics, they write that a truly honest person is so honest that they're honest in all their dealings, they're honest in their thoughts, they are not amused by tales of dishonesty. And I read that passage and I think I was doing well until that last one. Oh, well. I think maybe I need to work on this virtue if I'm still amused by tales of dishonesty. Can't win them all. In other ethical theories, you could use them for things like, what's the answer to this ethical dilemma? Virtue ethics says that embodying a virtue is a lifelong journey, and you can always be better at it. And it requires practical wisdom, knowing how to go about doing this in a logical way. So virtue epistemology is a combination of virtue ethics and epistemology. And virtue epistemologists say there are epistemic virtues that we can all strive to embody. This particular list of epistemic virtues is by Heersmink. I could give you 3 different lists. Every virtue epistemologist has their own list of what the epistemic virtues are. We could think about things like curiosity, intellectual autonomy, intellectual humility, open-mindedness, courage, tenacity. It's interesting to think about what it means to, how would we operationalize these definitions? And are these ideas actually useful to us as designers of technology that manipulate information? It's an interesting list. So I'll come back to that later. So within a virtue epistemology framework, knowledge is a collaborative achievement. It's hard, and it's not something you do alone. It's something that groups of people do together. John Greco has this great analogy to a soccer pass. Playing in a soccer game, Ted receives a brilliant, almost impossible pass. With the defense out of position and goalie lying prostrate on the ground, Ted kicks the ball into the net for an easy goal. The process of achieving knowledge is collaborative between our midfielder and our striker. The midfielder did most of the work and the striker kicked it into the goal, and together they achieved something. You, as someone considering what to believe, you need to decide when to believe someone. That's the problem of testimony. And the question here for us as internet researchers is, when I receive information on the internet, when am I justified in accepting it as true? So the problem of testimony in epistemology is of critical and central importance to our work in information sciences, HCI, and social computing. Okay, so far we know that knowledge is socially constructed, and the more something has been carefully reviewed, the more credibility it has. The mechanism for social construction of knowledge in science is peer review. So here's how peer review works. For a journal, for example, 3 people read a work. They're all experts on every part of the content of the work. If there's any subject matter in the thing they're reviewing that they're not familiar with, of course they learn all about it. If there are any references cited that they have not personally read that are cited in the manuscript, then they read them carefully before doing the review. Okay, maybe not. Maybe that's not really how peer review works in science. I think it's important when we think about reliability of information, think about how peer review really works in practice, not how it works in some idealistic fairy tale. The process has strengths and weaknesses, and one of the biggest challenges for the reliability of peer review is interdisciplinarity. When I review something these days, it's almost inevitable that it draws from multiple fields, and there'll be an area of what it's referring to that I know well, and 2/3 of it that I don't know at all. And I just take the authors at their word, and I hope that the other 2 reviewers know about the other parts of it, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. the more carefully something is reviewed, the more credible it is. So I started off, the title of this talk and the title of my book is Should You Believe Wikipedia? So if you want to answer the question, should you believe Wikipedia? The question you need to ask is, how is content on Wikipedia reviewed? I want to give you an example of a particular page. And I picked for this example, John Roberts' Wikipedia page. Next time someone becomes a justice of the US Supreme Court or becomes Pope, look at their Wikipedia page as it happens. It is a thing of great beauty to watch. John Roberts's page was created in May 2005, and at the time was 182 words. Through the end of July of that year, there were 9 edits. And then Justice Roberts was nominated for the Supreme Court. Here's Roberts's original page. Remember, on Wikipedia, you can look at every past version of every page. And this is the version of Roberts's page before his nomination. It's a paragraph. This is the whole thing, and says he's a potential nominee to the court. It says when he was born, where he got his degree, what his current job is, and that's about it. Okay, so on the day Roberts was nominated for the Supreme Court, there were 31 edits. By the end of that month, there were 1,200. And the current version of Roberts's page has gone from 200 words to 6,800. And it includes a complete concordance to all of his judicial opinions while he was before he was on the Supreme Court and while on the Supreme Court. It's comprehensive and truly impressive. And here's just the first couple paragraphs. It is a thing of beauty to watch these things evolve, where literally 1,200 edits were made in the course of a couple weeks. And the whole piece of information evolved over time. Okay, so let's compare the review processes between a high quality peer-reviewed journal article and a Wikipedia page. For a journal article, well, we have 3 expert reviewers who review it, maybe go through it a few times, and then it's fixed. And once we're done with the review, it's not changeable anymore. Wikipedia, for a popular page, there are literally thousands of reviewers. Now, those reviewers have varying levels of expertise. Some of them are experts and some of them are not. But the non-experts may have knowledge of Wikipedia formatting or grammar or other sorts of things. Vandalism is typically repaired in seconds, and it's updated continuously. If something notable and new happens to someone, it's updated in often seconds. During the presidential inauguration this year, I watched the page of pages of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and you can't make this up. These guys are so awesome. They were sworn in a little before noon, but they're only supposed to take office at noon. So someone updated Biden's page to say President of the United States when he took the oath of office, and someone else undid it with a comment saying he's not president until noon, even if he took the oath. And then at precisely noon, someone put the statement that he was president of the United States back again. Kind of amazing to watch. So for a popular Wikipedia page, if you think about the degree of review as a measure of the reliability of the information, this is really impressive. For a less popular page, the story is different. This is the page for the Massachusetts State House. It has a tag that it needs additional citations for verification. If you'll see on the bottom of this page, it says that the murals under the dome were painted by artist Edward Brodney, who had won a competition as part of a WPA initiative to paint them. Because Brodny had no money to pay models, he used his mother and sister and brother as models. And so the model for Columbia Queen of the Ocean is his sister, Norma Brodny. Okay, there's no real citation for the fact that Norma Brodny is the model. It's there because I put it there. Norma was my grandmother. Now, when I edited this page a very long time ago, you could sometimes get away with putting something unsourced on Wikipedia. Please don't delete it. I've been good. Don't hurt me. This has managed to stay on Wikipedia for a while, even though I don't know what source we would use to show you that. I promise you that it is true. How would you compare the page on the Massachusetts State House to the page on John Roberts? This is much less reliable. I just showed you something unsourced that I added. Can we get away with this unsourced statement on the page about the Massachusetts State House? Because no one but my mother cares about the murals in the Massachusetts State House. Nobody's looking. A less well-known page is much less reliable than a popular page.
Can I ask a question about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you're saying now it's harder to get away with this. Can you talk a little bit about the rule that stuff needs to be sourced? Because clearly you have that knowledge. And unless it's been cited in some kind of publication, it's like you're not allowed to put the knowledge into Wikipedia. And that seems to be problematic in its own sense. Like, for example, my brother's Wikipedia page has an incorrect fact about what country he was born in. And I can't change it. I know where he was born, yet somebody has a fake source or an incorrect source. And so how do you get to truth when there's rules like that?
It's a limitation. And in general, the quality of sources is a limitation of Wikipedia in general. If you wanted, you could put up a blog post explaining where your brother was born and then put the citation to your blog post on Wikipedia, and you might get away with that.
So you're saying you can make indirection to a low quality source and
which isn't what we want, right? What we want is high quality source. There's also the problem of a reference loop, and this happens a surprising degree of the time. And this is absolutely a weakness of Wikipedia. So here's how this goes. A journalist is writing an article and uses Wikipedia as a source and doesn't cite it. They take some info from Wikipedia. There's something uncited on Wikipedia. A journalist writes an article and copies the information from Wikipedia into the article. Then later, someone else comes back and says, there aren't enough citations on this page. I will search for a citation for this fact. They do an internet search and they find the journalist's article. So the appearance of support for the reference is created when in fact there is none. So the strength of citations and citation loops and, hey, how do I tell people that's really Norma? These are all things that I think could be improved. My argument is that a popular page is arguably the most accurate form of information ever created. I really mean that. It's crazy how careful this stuff is and how well updated and comprehensive and how carefully checked. You can even look at a page on a highly controversial topic and you'll be shocked at how reliable it is. A less popular page like the Massachusetts State House is a whole different story.
Is popularity easy for people to read based on just, I know John Roberts is popular, or do you look for how many edits there are? Is there some kind of indicator that I as a user could go, oh, that's probably a reliable page or not?
Right. And there have been a number of research projects to create visible metrics of how reliable a page is. And some of them are, it is not easy to see that. And that is a problem. There have been some research projects that generate metrics of reliability. Some of them are as simple as how often it's been edited. Some of them are more complex. For example, looking at, okay, who are the specific people who edited this page, and what is their reputation as an editor? Is this person a reliable cognitive process? I do think we could use more strongly visible metrics. There is a little bit of that in the warning on the Massachusetts State House page saying that this needs additional citations. That's one very visible indication that this isn't as reliable as you think. But yes, we absolutely need more. And this is a great example of where understanding the underlying nature of the construction of knowledge helps us to be better software designers, to think directly on what is important in this design. So the affordances of Wikipedia are well matched to the social construction of knowledge. We have things like revision history. You can see every past version of every page. Talk pages. Every page has a place where people can discuss the content and try and come to consensus. Wiki projects are pages that organize people who are interested in a particular topic. So for instance, there's Wiki Project Sharks and Wiki Project Medicine. And they'll do things like say, hey, we have a collaboration of the week. Let's all make the article about thresher sharks better this week. And everyone who's part of Wiki Project Sharks will all prioritize working on thresher sharks for the week. They'll do things in wiki projects like rating the quality of pages. Okay, these are our A quality pages, these are B, these are C. And then that can help direct volunteers' attention to places that need it more. Interestingly, many people don't know that the policy pages of Wikipedia are themselves editable by anyone. If you were to make an edit without getting consensus first on the talk page, it would be immediately reverted. But you can go and make changes to the policy on biographies of living people. And I did make one once, which was an interesting experience. So an old joke says Wikipedia doesn't work in theory, it only works in practice. Except maybe if we look at the right theory, maybe it does work in theory as well as in practice, because the affordances of the software are so well matched to this process of social construction of knowledge. So I want to pop up a level and ask a bigger question. I've been talking about philosophy. Is this actually useful? I think that in this case, we can leverage our understanding about the nature of truths and knowledge to be better designers of internet systems. For example, to facilitate social construction of knowledge, we need opportunities for people to review content. As indicated, we need visibility of the degree of review of content. We need support for consensus formation. And this applies obviously to, you can think about a lot of these affordances are there in Wikipedia. What would it mean to redesign Twitter or Reddit to have more of these affordances, to do more successful knowledge building? It's an interesting question. You might think about further how we might scaffold the process of evaluating testimony. The whole internet right now is the problem of testimony. How do I know what to believe? And again, metadata on the provenance of information and the credibility of sources is critical. So I told you I was going to come back to these epistemic virtues. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about. How useful are these? So could I pick one of these epistemic virtues and say, I'm going to read everything the philosophers have said about it, let's say intellectual humility, and come up with a more precise definition, and then leverage this in the design of an internet system? It's a really provocative question. Is that going to work, or is that a doomed endeavor? I don't know. I think the answer I've come up with so far is that I find these useful to keep around, rolling around in my head, but it's a little bit of a heavy lift to go from the philosophical literature on intellectual humility to, wow, well, we did an experiment and we tried to see, are people willing to change their mind? And we use this as a measure of humility. And this helps us to design better information systems in the following way. That is a long process, but it's an interesting one to think about. I was looking at this paper the other day on vulnerability in social epistemic networks. Just as an example, so philosophy and HCI are different approaches to knowledge in a fundamental sense. And a lot of philosophy is true, we think, but hard to make useful. So let's look at this notion of vulnerability in social epistemic networks. Sullivan et al. Are philosophers who are also nerds. I love these guys. And they looked at the problem of having the appearance of multiple sources for a piece of information when there's only one. So the red dot thinks that they got this piece of information from three sources. But in fact, all three of those sources also got the information from the same original source. So in fact, there's only one source. And so the question here then, and they talk about this as a vulnerable testimonial network, and the question they raise in their paper is, could you actually turn this into something useful? And in order to turn it into something useful, you need a whole lot of information about where every piece of information came from. And when I think about the data challenge of figuring out that this false appearance of multiple sources exists, how to actually do that in practice is hard. But I think it's promising. I think there's some synergy here that could be productive. So this talk is the title chapter of my book, Should You Believe Wikipedia? Online Communities and the Construction of Knowledge. The book is mostly actually not about Wikipedia. It's about design of online communities. And I have chapters on the nature of community, on the nature of collaboration. The Should You Believe Wikipedia chapter that this talk is based on is online. Thinking about knowledge construction and how the social construction of knowledge changes how we think. A chapter on online identity, one on bad behavior and how we manage it, which is increasingly an entire industry. And oddly, partway through, late in the writing of the book, I realized that I needed to add an additional chapter on business models. I think that how business models shape the design of systems is in many ways should be promoted to a top level concern for the study of socio-technical systems. And finally, I take a little time to reflect on how we can redesign this medium to bring out the best in us all. This is coming out this year. I'm supposed to get mail about what the cover is going to look like in another week or two, which is exciting. And I hope you all will find it interesting. I want to thank the Social Epistemology Network Facebook group, who are very patient with me. My students, my editor, Lauren Cowles at Cambridge, Terry Winograd for inviting me to speak to you all in 1997, Michael for inviting me to speak to you all this year, and Michelle for doing such a lovely job of organizing my schedule. And I would love to have a conversation and take questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy. I saw you had a question earlier. Do you still want to pop that one in?
Well, I was thinking about extremes in your point about the more popular a page is, the more reliable it is. So that seems to make a lot of sense in the middle. But I'm wondering, things like, George Bush, Donald Trump, President Obama, things that become super popular, or maybe those are special because they're polarized. If I remember correctly, they all get locked down, right? So then there's something else that's taking place. It's not just purely popularity. I wonder if you have anything to say about some of those.
Yeah, there is a lot more to Wikipedia than appears on the surface. And those mechanisms, for example, of sometimes locking a page, sometimes restricting a page to people who have over 500 edits. I have 450 edits. I've had 450 edits for a really long time, and a lot of pages are locked to people who don't have 500 edits. I think I need to put on my fun summer to-do list making 50 more nice constructive edits to Wikipedia. All of those mechanisms are important, and I think studying them in detail is important. And the ways that people use machine learning to help revert vandalism, the ways that people develop kind of professions in what they pay attention to. All of these things, I think, it's such a wonderful model. And my assertion is that we can learn from that model things that are applicable to the design of different other systems.
Thanks, Amy.
We've got a couple questions that are both circling around, I think, the same issue. I'll read them both out, and then you can sort of synthesize or select as is your want. Asks, you said if over 300 people say that there's a chair, then the chair is no longer subjective but objective. Wondering, are you suggesting that if there's something that can, quote unquote, make the majority of people believe something's true, that it automatically becomes the reality? And it's also asking a similar question, saying, if knowledge is socially constructed, how do we deal with the possibility that the mainstream consensus on a given topic is wrong, but so widespread as to appear reliable?
Dude, you're swimming in it. Yeah, that's a problem. Congratulations. Welcome to the problem that we find ourselves up to our eyeballs in. There are a lot of people who believe crazy stuff these days. Absolutely insane. So social consensus is the way that we decide what's true, but that doesn't mean that we're right. But now we're in Schrodinger's cat land. Is it alive or dead? If I can't tell if it's alive or dead without killing it, it's kind of a little bit of a moot question. It's dead. So yes, those are the questions, and that's what's broken, and that's what we need to find ways to fix.
I'm going to follow up on that. If that's what's broken, can you just point toward what would you do here, right? That seems like a very fundamental challenge of saying, if the majority of us are wrong, then we've socially constructed the wrong knowledge. What does a socio-technical system do about that? And what else can it do? Do we have philosopher kings?
So, I have a student who is currently working on a paper where they asked, found a bunch of people who posted false stories on the internet, and interviewed the people who posted them about those stories. And what we found was that the people fall into groups. One group literally stopped the interview and said, I didn't realize that was false. Hold on a second, I'm gonna take it down. Okay, now we can go back to talking. Another group at the far other extreme said, you are a victim of the globalist conspiracy. Fact checkers that story is true. The fact checker that said that it was false is incorrect, and you're deranged if you think that story is false. There were some people also in the middle who said, you said it was marked false by Snopes, but Snopes is just this liberal husband and wife team, and I just don't trust them. Ex-husband and ex-wife, long story. I just don't trust Snopes. So the people fall into these different categories, and I think the group in the middle is the one that we need to work with. The people who say, you're part of the globalist conspiracy, I ain't going there, I can't help them. Or maybe I can help them eventually, but that's hard. The people who say, look, I just don't like your fact checker, I think you can have a conversation with them, and that we can design information systems that are easier to interrogate and easier for people with a variety of backgrounds to say, okay, yeah, I actually buy that.
So the solution is to embed the epistemology into the design of the system. Like, this is how we prove something.
I think people fall into different groups, and there are different groups that we need to address. And there are different solutions. We're dividing these groups into personas, and I think we have different information solutions for the different personas.
I guess there's even a deeper one too for me, which is I really like the epistemic virtues that you laid out, but we obviously have a lot of variance in what values, different folks have. So, believing something to be real versus believing something to, take down the powerful, those are very different beliefs. So where isn't that part of the equation? Like, so it's not just the designing of the system, bringing epistemology, but also like, how do we, create these kinds of shared epistemic virtues?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for zoning, that we need more smaller online venues with shared assumptions, and fewer giant platforms where we have to agree on standards for absolutely everyone. So I used to make students in my online communities class look at, a long time ago, do a comparison between two Usenet groups, or later became Google groups, alt.feminism and soc.feminism. And the alt hierarchy was unmoderated, and you could say anything. And the soc hierarchy, the group soc.feminism, was moderated. To join soc.feminism, you had to agree on certain values about feminism. And then starting with those shared values, you could have a conversation on next steps. So you had kind of thoughtful discussions of feminism on soc.feminism, and alt.feminism was just a flame fest. Exactly, kind of incel sort of stuff that you might worry about. So on the other hand, if you wanted to have a thoughtful discussion about how statistics about the wage gap are calculated and question them, you would not be welcome on soc.feminism, right? So maybe we need a third space where that kind of conversation is welcome. We need different spaces with different ground rules, and I believe we need more nonprofit spaces. One of the fundamental arguments I end up making in the book is that I don't believe that the profit motive can ever make the right thing happen for either individuals or communities. And that what we need is more public platforms whose fundamental goal is not to maximize shareholder value, but is to create certain outcomes for individuals and for communities. And we need lots of small ones. So you can pick the one that suits you. I don't want to inflict my values on you, but there should be lots of choices rather than these giant totalizing platforms where they have to moderate to the least common denominator.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, actually, I now had a different question, I guess, than the one I was originally going to pose. Hi, Amy. I think a lot of what you pointed out as motivation is Wikipedia. And a lot of what impressed me about Wikipedia was the speed at which knowledge could be corrected or fact-checked or confirmed. And a lot of what powers that is the scope and scale. I mean, obviously, Wikipedia is a sort of like unique jewel of the internet in that it's not for profit and somehow is successful despite all of the reasoning about what would make a social computing system successful. So how do you think about this trade-off between having fragmented sort of platforms where people can adopt different norms around epistemology and the idea that scale brings with us this ability for these things to happen at the rate that makes Wikipedia work?
You're making my head hurt.
Oh, sorry.
You're right. You're right. In the case of Wikipedia, the scale is part of its power. So I just argued against scale, and now you're making a compelling argument for why scale is sometimes powerful. but there's no reason why we can't have both. That we need some big platforms and some little ones. The thing that Wikipedia has in common with the vision I articulated is its nonprofit nature.
And my question was, I think we were talking kind of earlier about like socially constructed knowledge and how we don't really know whether it's like true or false at times. And my question is like, whether it's true or false, do you think it's important that we build on these assumptions anyways? Because I kind of pulled the example in like my proofwriting classes, like we build on assumptions that we may or may not know are true or not, but we still like make important revelations from these. So where's your stance on that?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. I'm reading in the chat, Michael, asking you all to help my Wikipedia page. Thank you. It's very crufty. I would be so grateful. The one thing you get from hanging out with epistemologists is a definite sense that truth matters, and so remember I started off with this model that the world exists but is only knowable through our subjective perceptions. I do think we can be wrong, and correcting things when we're wrong is important. And no, it's not anything goes. There's such a thing as just being wrong. And now, can you sometimes come to positive consequences from slightly shaky premises? Of course, but that's called luck. But what's our alternative here? We work as hard as we can to get our premises to be solid and to build on them.
Hi. You just said something really interesting that I want to react to, but I don't have a really super well formulated question, so I'm going to try to struggle through it, which is the idea that it's valuable to have a bunch of different platforms with a bunch of different value sets, which I certainly agree with. But this week in particular, we've seen a lot of conversations about universal standards for speech, and in particular international human rights law as it applies to platform governance. So I guess my question is, do you have a reaction to the search for a universalism in platform governance? Is there something there, or is that a futile pursuit?
Well, I mean, there's certainly some things that shouldn't be allowed anywhere. So I think I agree with your suggestion that there's a bedrock of, look, I don't care who you are. Certain things are just not okay. And above that dead minimum, we need a little more tolerance for difference. And some of this is a very uncomfortable conversation. We could have a long chat about Gab and Parler and how we feel about them. I tend to come down on the free speech side of things and say, look, the remedy for bad speech is counter speech, and I don't want the government or other bodies telling me what I can and cannot say. But this is complicated and shockingly controversial. And I discuss this in detail in the book, but I do think rational people could disagree on these issues. There's some awful stuff out there. How can we allow that? On the other hand, there's totalitarian governments, and the government of India censoring tweets about how bad the COVID crisis is. I'm not sure I want to let government. So I believe Twitter censored tweets critical of Modi because they were legally compelled to. That's not cool. So what's the purpose of this whole medium if the government of India can censor criticism of its handling of the pandemic? So I think I come down a little more on the side of, yeah, there'll be some horrible stuff, but we don't want censorship. But rational people could come down on a lot of different spots on the spectrum. This is hard.
One final thought, I guess, and I say final only because we're almost out of time here. What about the process that the rules we choose to follow and whose voices are sort of amplified or cut out of that, in the sense that there may be approaches taken through like debates on Twitter or discussions on talk pages on Wikipedia and so on, that I think we've seen make some, privilege some voices and not others, based on who feels comfortable participating and in what environments. And I think that complicates this whole notion of, what socially constructive knowledge is, or whose knowledge it's capturing, like whose truth is a way of putting it. I'm just curious if you have thought about alternative designs that might address that issue better, or if not, why what we have now is maybe the best that we can come up with yet. Sort of maybe not an ideal, but again, maybe the best we know of.
Yeah, Michael, I think that problem is critical, really critical. Whose voice is getting amplified? And the suggestion I made before that we have different spaces with different sets of values and assumptions, I think can partially address that. But when there's a big space that and you're saying go to this smaller space, you're saying you're going to get a lot less attention for the ideas if you move, and if you're just creating echo chambers, how does that help? But then the question is, whose responsibility is it to answer this problem, right? I mean, the commercial platforms their responsibility is clear. It's to their shareholders to maximize shareholder value. So I do think there's a value here of helping a diversity of voices to be heard. And it's something that we need to consciously work towards. And it's not going to magically happen if we don't. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us. I will call it here. Amy, I'm sure would be happy to continue this discussion in someday in person now through virtual means, or feel free to drop her an email or read her book when it is out with Cambridge University Press, something, maximizing Bruckman value. So thank you again for joining us.